Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. That's what I've been saying for 3 years now to greet every Zoom, every Teams, every remote call I've had. So it's nice to be able to sit in front of real people and say, good afternoon. Um, Looking forward to talking with you. Um, Thank you very much for the people who suddenly decided that Sugar Pie Honeymoon is my walk-up music. That's actually my wife's and my song. So what I'd like to do for the next little while is take you on kind of a tour with a number of interesting stopping points, I hope, around our healthcare portfolio, primarily HealthShare, with some nods to things that we're doing with data platforms and with track care. And we'll talk about things that we have most recently done and released, with many of them with you in mind, and also talk about some of the things that are in our near future, things that are in the bucket right now. So I look forward to going over that with you. So fundamentally, I've always used this diagram to say kind of where we are in terms of HealthShare in particular and healthcare in general. We really are a platform and a solution provider and partner. On the one side, many of you use us as a data source. And all the things that we do to aggregate, to interoperate, to normalize, to clean data so that you can use it for whatever purposes you have. We strive with small and large and extremely large organizations to be able to be the most trusted source of that kind of aggregation, the most reliable source. And then over time, we came to realize that as we're doing these things, many people were doing the same kinds of solution sets on top of them. And it was going to be advantageous to you and to us if we can do some of these things. So being able to identify solution sets that are particularly well suited to the kinds of data services we provide, and then being able to make those available to you to shorten your workload and hopefully to make it much more efficient and effective. So we'll talk about a little bit of both of those as we go through our tour. So what's been going on? What drives us? You've heard a lot of this, I think, this morning and early this afternoon in some of the other talks. But these are kind of the big buckets of things that have shaped us, things that are happening in the world over the past few years, even over the past few months, that have changed our viewpoint on how the world is working, on how the healthcare world is working, and have influenced our own particular strategy for products. One of them, and we'll talk about this in and out throughout this entire presentation, is all of the new use cases that came up. Many of them pandemic-driven, which includes not only the ability to track communicable diseases like the pandemic, but also the rise in telehealth, the rise in home care, the different ways that care has been moved about, as well as the fact that as people come back into the healthcare marketplace, as they came back from not visiting their doctors for a long time, there was a lot to do in terms of non-communicable diseases and quality over cancer and diabetes and the rest. Being able to analyze large databases to see whether we can perform as a region or as a nation, or being able to analyze individuals to see if there's an intervention that's needed for you to make sure that your care is much better. Economics. So I'm also an A&E doc, and I still practice. I do about 3 shifts a month. And God, do we see this? The volume came up in huge amounts. The volume came up from being almost nothing in terms of elective, quote, elective emergency volume when at the beginning of the pandemic, all the way up to normal and now well above normal. The patients came back with a vengeance, the workers did not. So we find ourselves with incredible struggles to be able to not only handle people in things like A&E, but also to avoid having people come to A&E because they've actually gotten decent care elsewhere, which is where the source of it comes from. So a lot of this has led people to look at new ways of distributing care, new ways of being able to have appropriate matching of resources and patients all the way around. And this is the kind of thing which lends itself perfectly to a distributed care data source like HealthShare. Consumerism, you've heard about several times. It was an interesting talk from Nuffield earlier on about being able to analyze whether the patient's been to the gym recently. And if they haven't been to the gym recently, maybe that means that there's a problem with them. They want to find out if the patient's had an injury. And if the patient has had an injury, then maybe they should go see our therapists. So that kind of patient-facing, patient-interactive way of getting these new types of data that we haven't really stored before is one element of consumerism. And the other element is really a whole CRM play, which I think has not seen its like in healthcare until recently. Being able to have patients understood, even pre-patients, even persons who will perhaps someday be patients, and understanding them by other behaviors. If a patient goes to your website, if a person goes to your website, maybe that's someone you should reach out to. If a particular postal code is high incidence of a particular disease, maybe that's some place to reach out to. So consumerism, both on the patient-facing side and on the patient understanding side, have been huge trends in healthcare lately. And with all these first three has become new types of data. So social determinants, which we've talked about for quite some time, but we're starting to see them much more in active play now. Being able to understand not only an individual patient's data, but also the data of an entire community. Is this where opioid crises take place? Are there appropriate opioid resources? Supply chain data. Do we have enough ventilators? Do we have enough antibodies stocked in this location for this particular population? All these things are data that you don't necessarily find in your electronic health record, but are important for understanding health as we see it in 2022. And one other driver is just technology. You know, we don't know yet what the final jury will decide about the value of machine learning in healthcare. We think it's going to be great in imaging. We think it's going to be great in dermatology, probably some use in certain kinds of early assessment, but we don't know. But even the experiments that are necessary to find this out require large, extremely large amounts of good, clean, normalized, well put together data. So that's one example of how machine learning, big data go hand in hand. And then other technologies like cloud and what it means in terms of the ability to do efficient processing, to be able to do scalable processing. We will have all of these things as influences for healthcare in Intersystems. So if we take all these and boil them down and also think about the things we've already been doing on your behalf, with you as partners, learning from you at forums like this and all of the individual meetings we have with all of you, we come out with what really are the elements of our strategy. And at the top of all of it, and you'll see this a few times, is really a lot about flexibility. So there's COVID-19, and then there was monkeypox. Unfortunately, monkeypox seems to have done a Roman candle trick and come up and come down again. But there's also Ebola, which is coming back again a little bit in certain parts. There's always, epidemics tend to show up about every 18 months. But there's also new kinds of things that are similar in the ways that they are processed. So here's the point where we say, if we see 4 or 5 problems that can be solved in similar ways, ideally we would build not just a single solution to problem A and to problem B and problem C, but to build tool sets underneath, to build Lego blocks that can be put together much more easily for problem D when it shows up. So in both the platform side and the solution side, and you'll see in a few minutes, we've really been looking at ways to make more flexible, more multi-powered solutions for different answers. Performance and capacity, as we get more and more requests, deeper data, wider data, larger scales. We're working with someone right now who wants patient index to support 350 million persons. So that's impressive, and that makes us want to go back and test it against that number and make sure that if there's some additional that's needed, then we have the ability to handle that. So both on the processing side, processing efficiency of the deeper data that's coming in now, as well as on sheer numbers of transactions, numbers of notifications, we continually work on this. Use case solutions, and again, we'll get to this more, but a lot of the things that I just talked about, we're looking at dedicated solutions and dedicated solution sets that we can apply to particular high value, high importance use cases that you are telling us about and that we see in the environment. Analytics but a kind of a newer form of analytics. Analytics not just to be able to have a dashboard of what's going on. Analytics at the population and at the individual level. Analytics at the assessment and at the interventional level. Analytics at the query and individual rules and logic level. All of these things allow you to identify a particular patient, a particular situation, or a whole cluster that's able to solve that is in need of particular care that can be identified as a cohort with particular needs. We've always been supplying this, but there's a lot more happening now. And with all of this, again, data extensions that are necessary for these new problems, that are necessary for the community, that are necessary for new government regulations that call for new particular fire profiles, for example. And on top of all of that, trying to do this in such a way that it reduces cost. They say it's pretty hard to do something that's faster and better and cheaper, but I suppose in these elements, there's all three of those. So the ability to look at ways to reduce data footprints, ways to reduce implementation costs, ways to make things upgradable in spots, upgradable in fragments instead of doing large-scale big bangs, ways to be able to have processors that are much more active on Monday afternoon than they need to be on Saturday morning. So these are kind of the core elements of the strategy, and everything that we're doing really falls into one or more of these particular areas. And this is essentially the suite that we think about in terms of HealthShare itself, as well as Health Connect, and a lot of the things that we do in collaboration with data platforms and to some extent with TrackCare as well. So this is kind of our standard model. So you see that on the left is all the things that are driving to us. These are all these sources of data that you have, whether they be electronic medical records, whether they be social systems, life science research pieces, omics, genomics, and others. All that comes in, all of that generally makes its way through to Health Connect, our interface engine, and its cousins, and make their way to kind of the heart of where we go in HealthShare, which is the unified care record. And that's kind of the data pieces. But then all the way around the circle, you'll see different kinds of applications that can be done. So clinical visualization on the top right is something that most of you have been using for quite some time. There's been improvements there. Looking at rules and notifications, looking at ways to exchange data, to provide data access to patients as well as to others around your trust, otherwise all the way around the nation, as we just heard about more recently. Analytics, and then our core patient and provider identification systems, provider directory and patient index. And then patient index up at the top, which we skipped as well. So all of these things are different applications, different solutions that are built on top of the unified care record. So let's go into some more specific areas. So the UCR itself is something that's probably familiar to many of you. Fundamentally, it's data being collected, sometimes virtually, sometimes permanently, in the edges, in our Firestore, in Health Insight, in different kinds of formats. And then, as you can see, many of these things have APIs either coming out of SDA, our own standard architecture, our own standard data model, for things like the viewer and for the reports, and an increasing number that are based on FHIR, an increasing number that are FHIR-based APIs for our own things. So care coordination systems are actually built in care community using FHIR. Some of our rules engines are built basing FHIR. And then, of course, a lot of third-party things that we do, like smart apps attached to personal community, attached to our patient engagement solution. Behind all this is the system index, and this is something relatively new that we've released over actually earlier this year. And the system index is really a architectural upgrade. It's an architectural way to have much more selectivity, much more understanding and knowledge in what gets fed out of the host systems into UCR and into its component applications. So this gives you the chance, for example, in the clinical viewer to be able to get much faster performance getting to the first page because we're selecting the data that's necessary. For Health Insight, it allows you to get not only faster processing, reduced unnecessary data coming in, but also gives you the chance, for example, to spin up multiple Health Insight instances because you have different persons who should have access to different components of the data, something we couldn't do before, which we can do with System Index to be able to spin up multiple independent Health Insights, for example. So it's a nice overall tool that I think you'll see playing a lot of roles. It's been done for Health Insights, being done for the Access Gateway, if you're familiar with that, which will affect the viewer and other components. Data expansion also happens here, and we're looking for not only to expand specific areas of data based on new requirements that come out, but also we're building new tools that make it much faster so that when a new requirement comes out, and here's that flexibility again, next time there's something required, some new system, we want to be able to say, okay, here's the data you need. We can make it available next week in SDA, in SQL, in Fire, available in the viewer. That's the goal, and that's what's being actively worked on. One thing I'll sort of talk about in terms of modularity is the way that we are basically componentizing not only the UCR, but really the entire HealthShare Federation. So this is a typical setup. You have the edges, you have a registry, which is really where a lot of the core metadata lies, and then Health Insight. And right now, all of these are kind of locked together. If you're doing an upgrade, chances are you're upgrading all of these at once, which can be kind of a big process. They are locked together. If we upgrade one, we have to make sure that everything is upgraded in synchrony. So there are better ways to do this. And with the new advent of componentization, APIs, microservices, we can do some of that. So inside that edge is a storage component and a bunch of different kinds of processing components. So rather than saying, okay, every time I want to upgrade one of them, I have to make sure that everything else falls into line, we have the ability now to say, well, what if these things were actually all independent components connected to each other with micro APIs? And then if I say, okay, I need to spin up more capacity for this one. So most of the time right now, we have to give you the storage capacity and processing capacity to handle your greatest needs, which is fine. But would it be nice, particularly in things like a cloud environment, to say, let's only have you use this particular processing power on the weekends. And then when it comes time for Monday, or when we see that there's a need for more, we just go ahead and spin up another version of that. We just go ahead and spin up a third version of that. And suddenly you have increased capacity in that particular component that's compatible with everything else. Or if we're doing upgrades, over on the left here, we have something that's been running on version 2.0 of let's say, consent, and we suddenly decide that there's a new kind of consent that should be added or a new upgrade, then the ability to upgrade just that component while everything else stays intact makes your life much better in terms of the simplicity of upgrades. So some of these things depict the kinds of architectural things we're doing to make it possible to make your life easier, to make the whole management of one of our frameworks much smoother. We're seeing some of these things for those of you who are TrackCare customers. Some of the same kinds of concepts are being used there. So I think it's a very nice upgrade in terms of manageability. Fire continues to be something that's important in different ways and growing in importance. And Intersystems has always been kind of on top of things. Russ Leftwich, who's talking tomorrow, I believe, has been on the Fire board for a long time, since it existed, I suppose. And we have several other people who maintain close ties with the central decision-making groups and also simply just stay ahead of what's being required. So we see more applications now, third-party applications. We see Fire becoming kind of a lingua franca for all kinds of different exchange. We see that there are requirements for health quality measures that are being insisted to be in Fire. So we see more and more applications for those coming up. And we've provided a number of different things over the past year or so, which you may or may not be aware of. We provide a service within Amazon Web Service, and this is something is really more from our data platform colleagues, but it's germane to what we do in healthcare as well. So if you have another application that is in need of having a Fire repository, you can spin up the Intersystems Fire repo, the Fire Accelerator on AWS or on other services, and be able to have your out-of-the-box repo ready. If you have data coming in let's say, HL7, we actually have also on AWS the ability to do that translation. So we have our HL7 to Fire interface technology already there. And so you can take a random toolkit that you have that's putting out HL7, put it into these services, spin them up, and you'll have conversion to Fire and a place to store and manipulate that Fire. So that's one of the kinds of things that we do. Bulk Fire, something we've just come out in its earliest version. And in fact, the standard for Bulk Fire has just come out in its version, so it's not surprising because it's not even fully finalized yet. But Bulk Fire, for those of you who are aware or not, is really all about being able to perform queries that handle multiple patients, that provide the ability to give you a large bundle of Fire resources that can be used for analysis. So this is the ability in this case to take all of those different sources of Fire data, perhaps across the top, And our coordinator will put those together and give you, upon request, a large packet of information about 2,000 patients with their fire resources based on some particular query, based on some particular characteristic. So this, if you're starting to think about fire as an analysis tool, and fire will become more of that, then this is the way to deliver that kind of data. And kind of hand in hand with that, we're actually now able to provide SQL services directly onto Fire without having to recopy all of your Fire data onto a more normal SQL kind of repository. So if you have a Fire store, rather than having to copy it over to something else and letting that be the one that your analysis tools run against, we can have systems. The system here is ability to simply look at that Fire data, understand it, be able to project that data onto SQL and be able to do queries at quite high performance directly against that. So much less storage, much faster ability to spin this up, and the performance has been quite good on this. So think of all these different ways that Fire is becoming an ecosystem of its own, and therefore all these ways that we can provide with Intersystems tools to let you make the best use of that. So moving more to the solution side, because most of that was really kind of the database and the core side, let's talk about things that are applications and application sets that provide value on top of all that nicely clean data. Fundamentally, and this is sort of a flexibility argument as well, you can think of the core data like this. So there's the UCR, patient index, provider directory, the Health Insight core database, Firestore as needed. That's kind of the basics of what happens if you are looking at just the data format. But if you think about problems, if you think about a care coordination desire, you have a patient who's got a chronic disease and you're trying to follow them, well, that requires you to have care teams and care plans and forms and notifications. Or you're trying to find out all patients who are at hazard risk of out of control diabetes. Well, that's analysis, that's rules, that's the ability to have particular kinds of views. When we put all these together, it turns out that for the large majority of problems and use cases that come up, they tend to fall into combinations of these buckets. So here's my Lego analogy again. If you have in your Lego kit a place to do rules easily, and a place to do forms easily, and a place to do views easily, and a place to do notifications, then we can combine those. And that's exactly what we've been doing. And a lot of these things are out already. Some of those are late stage work in progress, but we see this as the manipulable, flexible, controllable set that allows you on a no-code, low-code basis to be able to create all kinds of different solutions to different sorts of problems. And we can help you map these to the kinds of particular clinical and health operations problems that you have. So Clinical Viewer is one particular application. I'm sure probably many of you are familiar with it. Clinical Viewer has evolved over the years from what we now call Clinical Viewer Classic, with trademark apologies to Coca-Cola. And the Clinical Viewer now has a much stronger, much friendlier interface. You'll find that it has graphing of much greater enhanced graphing, grouping, filtering, the ability to do different kinds of sorting, the ability to see different kinds of data types. In addition, there's been a substantial performance enhancement, which I know will probably be welcome news to many of you, so that the time to get to first view on a complicated patient is much improved and is going to be much improved again. And that's been a really focused effort of ours over the past several months to a year. So this has been, I think, a much stronger tool, a much more functional tool. And in addition, along with that, this last element about non-categorized data. So typically, when you go do an implementation of a new feed, you'll bring in things, we'll see which of those things map up to SDA, which of those things map up to the database we have, and then things which don't either have to have a expansion done, a new kind of extension to the database, or some of them get left behind. We have new technologies now that allow you to take those, particularly in HL7, and we're looking at others, and say, okay, this is currently non-categorized data, but we can bring it in anyway, and it's basically got more or less a self-defining way of allocating itself and a self-defined way of categorizing itself. So you can actually have that in a holding area And you can either decide that, yes, this is very important and it's something that we should actually do full coding on, or you can decide that it's not particularly important, it's just taking up space and we don't really need it, or you can decide it's something that we'll need later on. But we find that there's a lot of use for this because it makes implementation much faster. If you get a new feed, it'll make it much quicker to get that feed going and the ability to make changes later on without losing data. So a big advantage that you can see this data in the viewer, you can see it in certain kinds of particular viewing tools that we have. So analytics in its more classic part, Health Insight. This is, of course, the tool that we've had for a long time to provide population insights, to provide queries of all kinds of things. We pride it as being something which lets you do analytics on data within minutes after it occurs. So rather than waiting a whole day to get into your data warehouse, that data is available very quickly for rapid things like what's going on in your emergency department right now, or what you're waiting going on right at this moment. The ability to have that kind of rapid, low latency ingestion. Things we're doing with Health Insight more, continually working on higher capacity, on higher performance in both the feed and the processing, but we're also doing other things. We're working to have this work more compatibly with standard front-end tools, particularly Power BI. Doing that because we think that what we do is very good and is effective, and you can use the deep sea tools, the Intersystems analytics tools, but people at Power BI spend more time working on that particular user interface, and we spend more time working on the data. So we're happy to do the things that we're very good at and make that compatible. And there's a lot more people out there that probably come out of their university knowing how to program Power BI. So just like Data Platforms has done with having Python become a standard language, so we are moving to have Power BI become a standard front end, and other tools that let you do much more rapid modeling, much more rapid cube building. This chart is a hotspot map of COVID activity in the state of New York back from 2020 and 2021, and is one of a number of different things that Health Insight did for COVID. We provide, in the States, we provide the health information system for 13 or 14 of the 50 state exchanges. And most of those, all of those, had to do reporting, constant reporting. And it turns out that that reporting was based on data from their component parts, which was not very clean, not very organized. That was a good job for Intersystems to help with. They're doing that on an ongoing basis. And even as the pandemic goes to different phases, we see them doing much more in terms of hospitalization data, in terms of resource data. So we provided certain kinds of common structures that they can use. And even as we go further, we've learned part of that flexibility that can also be applied to people that were using it for monkeypox to track that early on, people that have been using it for flu, which will become important as flu and COVID kind of intermix over the next several months, people who are using it to do syndromic surveillance, not only for communicable disease, but also for things like opioid, also for things like even heart disease success and failure. So lots of different analytics that you can do, lots of different use cases that Health Insight applies itself to. But on top of all that, we're looking in the no-code vein to say, well, how can we make it even easier for you to generate new kinds of elements? So one of the use cases here is clinical quality measures. They tend to come out with a standard, although quite complicated set of requirements for who gets included, who's part of the denominator, who's not part of the denominator, rules that require complex value sets that change all the time, rules that require different kinds of things. And sometimes you have several different things that have to interact. So what we're seeing on the bottom is a whole series of breakdowns of a diabetic population which intermingle and answer those 8 things at the right, which are basically the diabetes quality criteria. So how many people have had kidney check, how many people have had hemoglobin A1C, how many have seen their foot doctor, and so on. So what we have now and what we are building, and this is work in progress, but is ready to be tested by eager people, is a low-code analytic solution builder that allows us to spin up value sets and be able to reuse those, allow us to have queries in such a form that we can calculate multiple of these things together, and that you could press a switch and do all of these analyses at once and then do them again. And that creates not only aggregate statistics for you, but which also creates dynamic cohorts, creates the ability to say, okay, there's 150 people, hopefully not that, hopefully less than that even, who have not fulfilled this particular criterion, and we can name them all, and we can assign something, a flag to their chart, so when they are seen, we can actually reach out to them, or even before they are seen, we can reach out to them with some kind of an outreach program. So you can get both individual information as well as aggregate information. So this is something which we've was spun up for diabetes initially, already got quick use for heart failure. We had a customer ask us about osteoporosis measures recently, and we did that in about 2 weeks. So this is something that can happen quite quickly, and we're very interested and excited about trying this out with you. Care community is something which has been, I think, particularly valuable here in the UK. In fact, most of our initial folks in Lincolnshire and several other of the regions have been working with us on this. And I think this has been something that has been shaped very much by what those of you who are using it have done. It's certainly a mature product, but this is our solution for care coordination. This is something where you have a patient which has complex needs, and you are trying to have a widely spread care team. You have a social care person, you have a home nurse, you have perhaps they're at a care home, perhaps they have a primary care. You want everybody on the team to be aware of what's going on with respect to a particular plan, whether that plan is something like social care interaction, whether that plan is something like end of life. You want everyone to be aware of this, everyone to be able to track when somebody else makes changes to it. So here, again, without using code, you can spin up new plans, you can spin up forms that provide the ability to add both structured and any kind of unstructured data into that plan, the ability to set up plans with tasks so that there's a sequence of things that need to happen and that people can know when it's their turn or when something they've been waiting for has occurred. So you can see for this, for transitions of care, for referrals, for any kind of thing where there's interaction across multiple people, this has become a really strong area. We've used this this is sort of a more basic one, which is done on a support care. This is kind of a overall summary care for a patient who is being seen both in primary as well as specialty care. You can see that we can generate all kinds of interesting forms for this. For people who were at the meeting yesterday, where I also showed this particular slide, it's always been a fake patient, but so many people said they were worried about it that I blotted it out anyway. So here we've obviously been able to duplicate the respect form, and so that kind of thing, respect forms, PHQ-9, all kinds of questionnaires, all kinds of calculatable things. These are among the many things that you can do with care community. So that's something which I think we've seen a lot of good growth here. And hand in hand with that, personal community not only talks about patient engagement, but talks about the ability for patients and providers to work together on plans like this. So personal community has been around for a long time. Many of you use it. It really gives you the same kind of data access at the patient-friendly level that you get from looking at an entire aggregation in a HealthShare system. It allows to do certain kinds of basic functions so that patients have one place to look for all their data, one place to look for all their providers to do requests. It has, for the past couple of years, been able to host all kinds of different third-party smart apps, log in through the NHS login system as well as its own. And then more recently, there's been, first of all, a major user interface update, which is, I think, very nice, both in functionality as well as beauty. And I think that one thing that's been added is kind of a harmony between the forms that are used in personal community and the forms used in care community, so that we now have the ability to share care plans from one place to another. So this happens to be a piece of care community where on the top, we're looking at a patient's active care plans. And then down at the bottom, we see that there's a need for patient interaction. So there's perhaps 20 elements of this care plan, and a few of which might be ongoing status reports that the patient makes. So there's actually an activity now where you can send the plan to the patient, and then the patient on their own mobile, on their own personal community connection, whether they use it on mobile or on a desktop, they will see that you've been asked to fill out this form, you've been asked to contribute to this plan, and they can then send that back. They can also see what the providers have been saying. There's all sorts of appropriate privacy protections on both sides, but this allows for a nice interaction. This is late work in progress to have this fully connected, but I think you'll see this in the spring. And it would be very interesting for those of you that are doing patient-connected care plans to work with us on this. The flip side of actionable analytics is kind of actionable intelligent notifications. I've worked on most of my life on clinical decision support, and that's really what the healthcare action engine is all about. This is about being able to take an individual patient, take a look at their data as it applies to many rules in a rule library, and then be able to spit out notifications or alerts or whatever else have you for anything you wish, most any kind of rule you wish to assemble. So it can trigger on a request by the viewer, or it can trigger on an ADT event like an admission or a discharge. It can trigger on a new lab result coming in, and then be able to run rule logic, which I'll show you in a moment. It also, by the way, will run on external logic sources. So if you have a machine learning engine that you want to put in place, we can do that. And then based on what comes out of that rule, what comes out of that logic, has the ability to notify through email, through our clinical message center, through a direct pipe back to compatible electronic health records, through CDS hooks, if you're familiar with that standard, and all sorts of different things that we can do. It can make use of and work with Health Insight together, but the flexibility of this is, again, one of the most important areas. So you can build literally within minutes, probably a little bit more if you wish, but not very long at all, to be able to make a case like this. So this is an osteoporosis, part of an osteoporosis rule, which looks for a patient of a certain age, has not had a DXA ordered, is a female. The trigger for this, I believe, was an admission with a particular diagnosis code for a fracture. So we're looking for appropriate testing in post-fracture elderly women. And then if these all come to be true, we will return this hooks card, notified however you wish, on osteoporosis screening requirements. And then how do you build it? Through FHIR. So here, if I want to build a new element to a rule, I can go to FHIR and say, gee, I need a new condition. I want to know if this patient has liver failure. So I say, that's a condition. I choose that out of the typical FHIR resource menu. And then we have a wizard which guides you through putting in the appropriate codes and subsets. So I say condition, and patient does have the condition, and here's the codes and the code sets I'm using, and say go, and that gets anded and ored and not into the rest of the thing that you just saw, and gets added to that rule. And here's how it might view in the clinical message center within HealthShare, within the Intersystems product. It might view as these kinds of pop-up cards that are available that can come when requested, or that can come when you've been notified about something occurring. But the same kind of CDS hooks package is a FHIR standard and can be made available into an email. It can be made available into, for those EMRs that can accept it, and Epic, for example, use it. I know that certain other ones have been at least working on it. The ability to actually put that right back into the EMR where they can see it directly. So lots of different ways to make use of this, and a lot of exciting ways to have any kind of rule or logic you want to perform. And so think about all the different things you can do with this. On the population side, lots of people using this for gaps in care, fulfillment against guidelines, being able to measure, as I mentioned, diabetes, heart failure, liver disease, all kinds of different things. ED frequent users. We were talking yesterday about the ability to track ED frequent users as an analytic. That's something which can be done with Health Insight to make that. It's something which could even be done as you're seeing a particular patient with the rule engine. So you could use both of those and be able to not only know how many people are doing this, how big a problem it is, but know when an individual patient comes in that you need them for this. On the individual side, looking for hazards, looking for risks that are happening with this patient, everything from long-term sepsis risk to cardiac risk. We can do scores. Being able to look at treatment optimization for different things. So a patient who's not on a particular medication who ought to be. And again, sort of hooking this together shortly with care communities so that we can get notifications that are tied to the completion of new steps in a care plan. Being able to look at that for how people collaborate across a referral when it's your turn to do something. So, looking at reality, most of the things you've seen on Health Insight are things that have been around for a long time. The Health Insight solutions are things that are in active mid-stage development and ready to look at it with a beta partner. The Action Engine is something which we have tested locally and are working with a couple of early partners on how that will work out. So those of you that want to look at it early are welcome to. Otherwise, you will see this probably in full-fledged over the next 6 months to a year. And then just to round out our product portfolio, Provider Directory has undergone new things. Both Provider Directory and Patient Index have certainly had a lot of requests for increased capacity. As we see mergers, as we see larger organizations coming to our door because they know we can handle the large ones in the first place, we're having even organizations that are not healthcare themselves, but that are industries that deal with healthcare that have been asking to do extremely large databases to manage, for example, providers ordering an imaging test, or patients that are not so much patients, but persons across many, many different centers that do imaging. So on the patient index side, we're looking at different techniques like referential matching, machine learning, which we've already done work with, all sorts of things to continue to reduce that work list that has to be handled manually, and looking at ever higher capacity. And then on the directory side, not only more refined searching, more specific management of the providers across your region so that it can be done at a local site or at the trust level, but also the ability to use that directory information, for example, for looking at adequacy of care services. So that's kind of a nice tour of the applications and the services and the solutions. And I did want to get back to this whole thing about the cost of HealthShare. We looked at this over quite some time and have several different threads, really focused on faster implementation. You saw some of that with the non-categorized data. You saw some of that with the system index. You've seen some of that with the microservices, all of which can provide much faster and hopefully cheaper implementation. We've also done a lot with storage requirements. And if you haven't been able to take advantage of these so far, or haven't been aware of them, you probably should contact us, because through stream compression, through optimizing the ability to keep of what data is being audited and how that audit data is in primary or secondary storage, by looking at different kinds of data feeds, by doing all kinds of manipulations with the non-categorized data, you can see some stunning reductions just on the compression basis. Looking at ways that we've been able to do stream compression, which is now a standard part of what happens on our edges. You can get compressions up to 90% based on the types of data that you have. Database compression at disk level, and then being able to look at different ways that we are both compressing to a greater degree journals, archives, audits, things you don't use as much. So lots of different techniques that we're using to make the overall cost and the overall time to do new updates to be much faster. So that kind of takes us around the circle. We think that we have done a lot of work to handle some of those new stimuli that are coming out that I showed you on the first slide. Most of these things fit the strategy that across that, but really most of these things fit you. Most of these fit problems and issues and opportunities that many of you have worked on. We are overjoyed at the ability of this conference to take place because we get to talk with you in ways that we can't in some other ways. It's great to have that same kind of direct contact with you. So I'm going to stop here and hope this gives you some information about where we're going. I'm happy to take questions if there is time allowed. And we look forward to talking with you for the rest of this conference and beyond.